My son once looked me straight in the eye and said, "Old man, you'll die with nothing. Stop pretending you matter." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even flinch. He just said it like it was a fact. Those words stayed in my chest like a nail hammered deep. I smiled that day, pretending it didn't hurt. But inside, something cracked. People say time softens pain. It doesn't. It just hides it better. I'm Earl Dawson, 74 years old, a retired mechanic, a father to a man who stopped calling me Dad a long time ago. He thought I had nothing, but when I died, he found out that nothing was the most powerful thing I ever gave him. If you're watching this, stay till the end, because this isn't a story about money or revenge. It's about what a man leaves behind when love is no longer enough. And before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story travels. After my wife Grace passed away, the house got too quiet. The clock ticked louder. The wind felt colder, and every night the same chair across the table stayed empty. I filled my days fixing old tools, polishing the same wrench used for 20 years, and keeping the little garden she loved alive. The roses still, but the laughter was gone. Every morning, I'd stop by Mel's Diner down the road. Same order. 2 eggs, black coffee. The waitress, Betty, always smiled and said, "How's the old toolbox holding up, Earl?" I'd laugh and tell her it's holding better than me. Life was small, but it was mine. Simple, peaceful, and honest. Michael, my son, didn't visit much. He worked in the city, wearing suits that probably cost more than my old truck. When he came by, it wasn't to talk about life. It was to talk about my life, what he thought I was wasting. "Dad, you can't live like this," he'd say, walking around the house like a real estate agent. "Sell the place. Move in with me. You've got no savings, no plan. You'll die with nothing." I'd smile and tell him, "Son, I have what I need." He'd sigh, look at the fading photo and shake his head. "You call this living?" That's the thing about people who chase money. They stop seeing what's real. He didn't see the memory of those walls or the hands that built them. He only saw dust. I saw Grace in every corner. I never argued. I'd just nod and to drive safe back to the city. But every time he left, the silence grew heavier. Not because I was alone, but because I realized how far my son's heart had gone. And yet, I still hoped one day he'd see me, not as an old man in a dying house, but as the father who once carried him on his shoulders through that same garden. I didn't know it then, but the day wasn't loud or dramatic. It started quietly, like most days do when you're old and tired. I woke up to the sound of the kettle whistling and the morning light creeping through the curtains Grace had sewn years ago. I sat down at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, looking at the empty chair across from me, and wondering how many mornings I had left. My hands shook a little more than usual, and my breath felt heavier. I thought maybe I just needed rest, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Later that week, I went to the clinic after coughing up blood. The doctor, a kind young woman named Dr. Patel, placed her hand on mine and said, "Mr. Dawson, your lungs are weaker than we thought. You'll need to take it easy from now on." I nodded and smiled like it didn't matter, but as I walked out, the truth hit me harder than I expected. I didn't have much time left, and the little time I had, I was spending alone. When Michael found out, it wasn't because I called him. Betty from the diner did. She thought maybe a son should know his father wasn't doing well. He showed up 2 days later, wearing a suit, talking on his phone as he walked into my house like it was a business meeting. I watched him stand there in the same living room where he'd once built toy cars with me as a kid, but now his eyes didn't see any of that. They only saw the dust on the shelves and the peeling paint. "Dad, you can't stay here," he said, his tone sharp, not concerned. "You're sick. This house is falling apart, and you don't have anyone to take care of you. I already looked into a care facility near me. It's clean, safe, and you'll have nurses." I smiled faintly. "You mean strangers to watch me die?" He frowned. "That's not what I said." "But that's what you meant," I replied. "You don't want to take care of me, Michael. You just want to check a box and move on." His voice rose, frustration spilling out. "Dad, you're being stubborn again. You've got nothing here. No money, no future. You're living in the past. You think fixing old junk and watering flowers means something?" I looked around the room. The sunlight touched the framed picture of Grace on the mantel. I looked back at him. It means everything." He shook his head and muttered, "You'll die with nothing, old man." Then he turned and walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. I sat there for after he left, listening to the house settle. I thought about Grace. She used to say, "A home doesn't fall apart from age, Earl. It falls apart when love leaves it." I realized then that my home wasn't falling apart because of time. It was because my son had stopped believing in what it stood for. That night, I sat in my workshop, surrounded by my old tools, the smell of grease and wood filling the air. My body was weak, but my mind was clear. I thought about Michael's words, and for the first time, I didn't feel angry. I just felt sorry for him. He had everything a man could want: a career, a big house, a nice car. But he'd lost the one thing that made all of it mean something: heart. Over the next few weeks, I tried to reach him again. I called a few times, but he rarely answered. When he did, it was quick and cold. "I'm busy, Dad. Can we talk later?" "Sure, son," I'd say. But later never came. I started getting weaker, coughing more, sleeping less. Betty would bring me soup and sit with me for a while. She'd say, "You raised a good boy, Earl. Maybe he just needs time." I'd smile, but we both knew time was the one thing I was running out of. Then came Thanksgiving. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd show up. I cooked a small meal for one, roasted a little turkey leg, and set out 2 plates anyway, mine and Grace's. The night passed in silence. The only sound was the ticking clock. No call, no message. The next morning, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Michael. Inside, there was no "Dear Dad," no warmth, just a note that said, "Dad, I've talked to a realtor. You should sell the house before it collapses. It's time to move on." I read that letter 5 times, then folded it neatly and placed it beside Grace's photo. That was the moment something inside me shifted, not out of anger, but clarity. My son wasn't cruel. He was blind to the things that mattered most. That night, I made a decision. If I couldn't change his heart while I was alive, maybe I could after I was gone. I opened my drawer, pulled out my old address book, and found the name I needed: Sarah Monroe. She was Grace's closest friend and now a respected attorney. I called her and said, "Sarah, I think it's time we talk about a will." She asked softly, "Earl, are you sure you're ready for that?" I smiled through the pain. I've been ready for a long time. That single phone call marked the start of something bigger than both of us. My story was no longer about dying with nothing. It was about leaving behind something no amount of money could ever buy. A final lesson my son would never forget. The day I met with Sarah Monroe, the autumn wind had started to strip the trees bare. The world looked quiet and tired, just like me. I put on the same brown coat Grace bought me for my 60th birthday and drove my old pickup into town. The truck coughed and rattled like an old friend trying its best to keep up. As I passed the diner, Betty waved from the window, holding up a thermos of coffee. I smiled and waved back. She didn't need to say anything. She already knew what kind of day it was. Sarah's law office sat above the pharmacy, in the same building where I'd once fixed a leaky pipe for her husband years ago. Time has a strange way of bringing people full circle. When I walked in, she stood up from her desk with a warm smile, her short gray hair tucked neatly behind her ears. "Earl Dawson," she said, "you look the same as always, just wiser." I chuckled. "Wiser or wearier, I'm not sure which." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit, old friend. Tell me what's on your mind." I took a deep breath. "I want to make a will." Her smile faded slightly. "Earl, is everything all right?" "I'm not dying tomorrow," I said, "but I know I'm closer to the end than the beginning. My son and we're not on the best terms." Sarah nodded slowly. "You two had a falling out?" "Something like that. He thinks I've wasted my life because I don't have much to show for it. No big savings, no business, no empire. Just this old house, my tools, and a few good memories. He told me I'd die with nothing." Sarah's eyes softened. "And you want to make sure he doesn't take what's left?" I smiled faintly. "No, Sarah. I want to make sure he takes what really matters." We talked for hours that day. I told her about Michael's childhood, the nights we stayed up fixing his toy car, the times he fell asleep in the back of my truck after fishing trips, How he used to say he wanted to be just like Dad. Somewhere along the way, he stopped saying it. I told her how I didn't want to punish him. I just wanted him to understand what he'd forgotten. So, I gave her my instructions. I wanted my small savings and the house sold after my passing. Half of the money would go to a trade scholarship for kids who couldn't afford college but had the will to work with their hands. Grace always said the world needed more people who could build things, not just talk about them. I named it the Grace and Earl Dawson Foundation. The rest, I wanted handled carefully. Sarah raised an eyebrow when she read the first line I wrote for my son. To my son, who wished me nothing, he gets exactly that. She looked at me, a bit uncertain. That's strong, Earl. I nodded. It's meant to be. But that's not the end of it. You'll know when to give him the rest. She tilted her head. There's more? I leaned back in my chair. I'll leave him something only he can find, something that might open his eyes. After we finalized everything, Sarah folded the papers and placed them neatly into a brown envelope. You're sure about this? She asked again. I've never been sure of anything, I said, standing up slowly. This isn't revenge, Sarah. It's a lesson. I just hope he's ready to learn it. On my way out, I stopped at the diner. Betty poured me a cup of coffee and said, You look lighter, Earl, like a man who's done what he needed to do. I smiled. Maybe I finally have. The days that followed felt different. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. I just wanted to leave quietly and make sure the little I had found its way to the right hearts. I spent my mornings writing letters, one to Michael and one to Sarah. The one for Sarah had clear instructions. Don't give him everything at once. Let him feel the weight of those words before you show him what's real. The letter for Michael took me longer. I rewrote it several times before settling on what I wanted to say. It wasn't bitter or angry. It was honest. I told him how proud I was, even when he forgot to call, how I understood the world he lived in, loud, fast, and unforgiving. I told him that love doesn't always look like success, and that sometimes the people who seem to have the least are the ones who gave the most. I ended it with, You always mattered, son, even when you thought I didn't. I tucked that letter into a wooden box in my workshop, under the bench where we built his first model airplane together. I carved his initials on the lid, just like I used to when he was a boy. As the days turned into weeks, I grew weaker. The air felt thinner. My steps slower, but I felt calm. Each night, I sat in my chair, holding Grace's photo, whispering to her about the day. I think I did it right this time, Grace, I'd say. He'll understand, even if it's too late for me to see it. One evening, Betty came by to bring me dinner. She found me sitting by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky gold. That's a beautiful view, she said softly. It is, I whispered. Grace used to say the sunset was proof that endings can still be beautiful. A few days later, I didn't wake up. When Sarah got the call, she did exactly what I asked. She kept the will sealed until the funeral. Michael had no idea that the same man he called old and useless had left behind something that would change him forever. The story of my life wasn't written in money or property. It was written in love, work, and one simple message. A message waiting for the right time to be heard, and that time was coming soon. The church smelled faintly of old wood and lilies. It was a small place, the kind that creaked when people walked in, the kind that felt more like home than a building. The morning sun slipped through the stained glass windows, scattering soft colors across the floor. Only a handful of people came. Betty from the diner, Dr. Patel, two of my old neighbors, and Sarah Monroe, the lawyer. They sat quietly, their faces lined with the sadness that comes from losing someone gentle. Then, an expensive black car pulled up outside. The engine hummed even after the door opened, as if it didn't want to rest. Michael stepped out, wearing a crisp suit and a look of discomfort. He wasn't crying, he wasn't even frowning. He looked like a man who didn't know how to feel. He walked inside, nodding stiffly at the few people who recognized him. Some whispered, others just stared. He took a seat in the back pew, alone, his eyes moving around the room as if searching for proof his father had meant more to people than he ever realized. When the pastor began to speak, his words were simple. Earl Dawson was a man who built things that lasted, maybe not fortunes, maybe not fame, but things made with care, with love, and with hands that never stopped working. Michael looked down at his shoes. The words seemed to echo in his chest, but he pushed the feeling away. When the service ended, people stood one by one, placing a single white rose on the closed casket. Betty whispered, "Rest easy, Earl," and wiped her eyes. Sarah walked over to Michael as the crowd began to leave. She held a brown envelope in her hands. "Mr. Dawson," she said softly, "your father left this for you." Michael stared at the envelope, confused. "I thought he didn't have anything to leave." Sarah's expression was unreadable. "He had more than you think. This is his will. You can open it here or in private. He wanted you to read it yourself." Michael hesitated, but curiosity won. He broke the seal right there in the empty church, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a single page with neat handwriting. The first line read, "To my son, who wished me nothing, he gets exactly that." For a moment, the words didn't make sense. Then they hit him like a punch to the chest. His face flushed with anger. He crumpled the paper and muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable. Even dead, he's trying to teach me something." Sarah stepped closer. "There's more, Michael. He left something else, but he wanted me to give it to you later. He said you'd need time to understand this part first." Michael laughed bitterly. "Understand? What's there to understand? He just admitted he left me nothing." Sarah looked at him calmly. "He left you exactly what you asked for." Those words stuck in his mind long after he drove away. That night, he sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by everything he once thought defined success: glass tables, expensive art, and silence. He poured himself a drink and stared at the crumpled letter. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "You don't want me there, son. You want my house sold so you can feel less guilty." He tried to shake it off, but guilt has a way of sitting quietly until it becomes unbearable. A week later, Sarah called him again. "There's something you should see," she said. "Can you come to my office tomorrow?" When he arrived, she handed him a second envelope, heavier than the first. Inside was a short letter and a document. The letter read, "Michael, you've always chased things you could touch, count, or spend. I don't blame you. The world taught you that's what matters. But there's another kind of wealth, the kind that can't be seen until it's gone. I left my money and home to a scholarship fund in your mother's name. It will help kids who want to learn trades, just like I once did. If you want to know what I truly left for you, go to the workshop. Look under the bench. You'll find it there." "Dad!" Michael froze. The anger drained from his face. For the first time in years, he felt something heavier than pride: regret. He drove to his father's old house the next morning. The drive felt longer than usual, like the road itself was forcing him to think. When he pulled up, the house looked smaller than he remembered, but somehow still alive. The garden had grown wild, the roses blooming stubbornly despite neglect. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of oil and cedar wood. Everything was still there. The old clock, the photos on the wall, the dent in the floor he'd made as a kid. He walked into the workshop, the room that had once been his favorite place in the world. Dust floated through the sunlight that came in through the cracked window. He knelt down and looked under the bench. There, wrapped in an old flannel cloth, was a small wooden box. His initials, MD, were carved on the top. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside were his childhood drawings, a broken toy car they had built together, and a folded letter. He opened it slowly. "You always mattered, son. You just forgot how to see it. The world will make you believe that worth comes from what you own, but real worth comes from who you are when no one's watching. I hope one day you'll build something, not for profit, but for purpose. That's how you'll find me again." Michael pressed the letter to his chest and sank to the floor. For the first time in years, he cried, not out of anger, but out of love and loss all at once. When he finally walked out of the house, the morning sun had broken through the clouds. He looked back at the place he once called nothing and whispered, "You were right, Dad. You didn't die with nothing. You died with everything that mattered. The man who once thought wealth was measured in dollars now knew his father's true inheritance: love, integrity, and a legacy that could never be bought. The days after Michael's visit to his father's old home felt strangely quiet. The city noise that once comforted him now sounded hollow. He sat in his apartment, staring at the letter from his father again and again, reading the words until they felt carved into his heart. "You always mattered, son. You just forgot how to see it." He whispered it under his breath, as if saying it enough times would bring the old man back. But all it brought was the sound of his own guilt echoing through an empty room. That weekend, Michael drove back to the small town where he grew up. He parked near the diner, the same place he used to eat pancakes with his parents on Sunday mornings. Betty was wiping down the counter when she noticed him through the glass. Her eyes softened. "You must be Earl's boy," she said as he walked in. "He used to sit right there every morning. Black coffee, 2 eggs, toast with no butter." Michael nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, that sounds like him." Betty poured him a cup of coffee without asking. "He was proud of you, you know," she said quietly. "Always told people his son worked in the city, making something of himself." Michael looked down. "I never gave him much reason to be proud." She smiled kindly. "Oh, he didn't care about reasons. Love doesn't keep score." That line hit him harder than he expected. He sat there for a long time after she walked away, staring at the steam rising from the coffee cup, thinking about all the times his father had waited for his calls that never came. He realized his father never wanted wealth or recognition. He just wanted time with his son that he never got. Before leaving town, Michael stopped by the churchyard where his father was buried. The grass was still fresh, and the small wooden cross had his name carved into it: Earl Dawson. A man who built things that lasted. He knelt down, his hand brushing the letters. "You were right, Dad," he said softly. "You didn't die with nothing. You left behind everything I needed." He stayed there until the sun began to set, watching the sky turn the same golden color his father loved to watch from the window. It felt like a silent conversation, a goodbye that carried forgiveness on both sides. Back in the city, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something in him had changed. The office lights, the board meetings, the endless competition, they all felt empty now. For years, he had chased success like a finish line, but standing there with his father's letter, he finally saw how hollow that race was. He started visiting the foundation his father had created, the Grace and Earl Dawson Fund. The first time he walked through the workshop filled with young students learning carpentry and mechanics, he could barely hold back tears. A teenage boy looked up from a workbench and smiled. "Are you Mr. Dawson, the founder's son?" Michael hesitated before answering, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess I am." The boy held up a small wooden birdhouse. "They told us your dad built things with his hands. I'm trying to learn that too." Michael smiled faintly. He'd like that. He believed the world needs people who can build things that last. The boy grinned and said, "Guess you both do." That single moment cracked something open inside him. Michael began visiting every week. He helped fix broken machines, taught students how to plan small projects, and even started repairing old tools, some of which once belonged to his father. Slowly, the workshop became his peace, a place where grief turned into purpose. Months later, during a ceremony, the foundation unveiled a new plaque in honor of Earl and Grace. Michael stood at the podium, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "My father wasn't a rich man," he began, "but he left behind more wealth than I could ever count. He taught me that true success isn't what you have, it's what you leave behind in others." This foundation isn't just his legacy, it's a reminder that love, kindness, and hard work never die. They live on in every life they touch. The audience stood in applause, some with tears in their eyes. Michael looked up for a moment, imagining his father sitting in the back, smiling quietly, proud, but humble, as always. For the first time, Michael felt at peace. That evening, after everyone had left, he walked to the old workshop where his father's tools still hung on the wall. He turned the small sign by the door from closed to open. The neon light flickered to life, casting a warm glow across the room. He whispered, "It's open again, Dad. Just like you wanted." He sat at the old workbench and picked up one of the engraved wrenches, running his fingers along the handle. He could almost feel his father's calloused hands guiding his own. "You built this world, Dad," he said softly, "and now it's my turn to keep it standing." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of oil, sawdust, and roses from the garden. The same garden Earl once tended for Grace. Life had come full circle. Michael smiled faintly as he switched off the lights and stepped outside. The night was quiet, but his heart was no longer heavy. For the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. He finally understood what his father meant about building things that last, not from money, but from meaning. He looked back one last time at the workshop glowing in the dark and whispered, "Thank you, Dad." As the camera fades out on the glowing open sign, a soft voiceover closes the story. Some people leave behind money, others leave behind meaning, and sometimes meaning is worth far more. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Your stories keep these lessons alive.